Good morning. Welcome to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. I'm Kim McClary, President and CEO, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to today's program. Thank you all for your ongoing viewership and support. For our members, we're scheduling a number of special, exclusive events beginning in July, and we are bringing back in-person events to everyone right after Labor Day. So stay tuned. Jessica and Marion are booking some tremendous programs for you, both live stream and in person. If you're not a member, please consider joining our community of thoughtful, civic-minded individuals passionate about discussing domestic and international affairs, politics, and policy. Just click on the membership tab on our website and sign up today. For those of you who want to ask Dan questions, there's a control panel on the right-hand side of your screen where you can type in your questions. Jessica DeGanzik, our Vice President of Events, will be managing your questions during the Q&A portion of today's program. It's now my favorite time to bring Dan on, politics professor Dan Schnur, with three great topics today. Hey, Dan.
Hey, Kim, how are you?
Here we go. Another full day of discussion, plus members are going to be participating in your after program discussion right after today's program.
Well, we definitely have a lot to talk about. I'm really looking forward to it.
Well, let's get to your topics. Number one, the future of the Supreme Court. Biden, Breyer, and question mark, Iran's elections. Will it make things better or worse? And how to find a compromise on the filibuster. Here you go, Dan. Take it away.
Well, thanks so much, Kim. And thanks, as always, to all of you for taking the time to join us each week for these conversations. I really enjoy them, and I hope you do as well. As Kim mentioned, there's a lot to talk about this week. Narrowing to three topics was really a challenge. Today the Senate is deliberating on the voting rights bill. There's an election for mayor of New York City. It was even reported this morning that Donald Trump, as president, had considered suing Saturday Night Live for their depiction of him. So lots of things we could be talking about. But as Kim mentioned, the three topics we've chosen will hopefully get us through the first half of the program. And then at the bottom or near the bottom of the hour, of course, we'll open it up to your questions to talk about any of these three topics or anything else that you'd prefer to discuss. So let's start with the Supreme Court. Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer is 82 years old. He'll be 83 in August. And that makes him, by some margin, the oldest justice appointed by a Democratic president. As we all know at this point, there are 6 justices appointed by Republican presidents and 3 appointed by Democrats. Breyer is 82, and just for the record, Elena Kagan is 61 years old, and Sonia Sotomayor is 66. And because Breyer is the oldest, ever since Joe Biden took office, Breyer's been under tremendous pressure from progressive activists and some members of Congress to step down within the next year, because that would allow Biden to appoint his replacement. And this is a direct result, of course, of the Senate Republicans' refusal to grant a confirmation hearing to now Attorney General Merrick Garland when he was nominated to the court following Justice Antonin Scalia's death during Barack Obama's last year in office in 2016. And as many of you, I'm sure, remember, there had been some pressure, not a great deal, but some pressure on Ruth Bader Ginsburg to consider stepping down before the end of Obama's term as well. But Ginsburg believed that Hillary Clinton would be elected president. And so, of course, when she did pass, she was replaced not by the nominee of a Democratic president, but by Donald Trump's nominee of Amy Coney Barrett. So given all that, there's a lot of Democrats who are worried that if Republicans retake the majority in the Senate in the midterm elections next year, that a Biden nominee to replace Breyer at that point could meet the same fate as Garland, and that the seat would sit empty until after the next presidential election, and which of course in 2024, there's a reasonable chance that election could be won by a Republican president, and that new Republican president would nominate Breyer's replacement the same way Donald Trump nominated Neil Gorsuch after he took office in 2017. So first question for all of you is, I'd like to get your opinion on this. What do you think Justice Breyer should do? Do you think he should, pretty straightforward question, do you think he should retire before the midterm elections next year in order to make sure that Biden is able to replace him with a like-minded justice? Or alternatively, since he has not shown any signs of slowing down mentally or physically, should he continue to serve as so many other justices have until his health or other reasons make him decide that it's time to step down on his own terms? So Claire, what do we have for our response from our group today? Boy, overwhelming, look at that. Very interesting. 80% of you think Breyer should retire so he can be replaced by a Biden nominated replacement, rather than continuing on his term the way so many other justices have. It's really interesting. Now, I think the concerns that spurred that kind of a response were stoked last week, and I'm guessing that many of you saw this, when Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell did an interview in which he confirmed that McConnell still believed that there was historical precedent to leave a vacancy that occurred in 2024 open until after the next election. Now, most of you remember this, but just as a reminder, McConnell's argument is, and back in 2016 is that a Senate controlled by the opposition party to the president is not obligated to confirm that president's nominee. And he cited a speech that Senator Joe Biden gave back in 1992, in which Biden argued that President George H.W. Bush, should wait until after the election to appoint a replacement if a Supreme Court seat became vacant during the summer when Bush was running for re-election against Bill Clinton. Or alternatively, Biden said that Bush should feel obligated to appoint a moderate, acceptable to the then Democratic majority Senate. Now, Biden responded to McConnell's recollection by saying that Biden's position was and has remained that the president and Congress should work together to overcome partisan differences regarding judicial nominations. And Biden points to the advise and consent language in the US Constitution. And McConnell's response is that the Republican Senate's advice to Barack Obama was that he needed to nominate a more acceptable nominee, and the argument quickly devolved over whether there should be hearings or not. But let's come back to the present day, because in that interview last week, not only did Mitch McConnell say that he felt that if Biden were to face the possibility of nominating a justice in 2024, that if the Republicans controlled the Senate, that McConnell did not think there would be any need to hold hearings. McConnell also hinted in that interview that he might make the same decision. He didn't say he would, he said he might make the same decision for a vacancy that occurred not just in 2024 during Biden's re-election year, but that McConnell might decide not to hold hearings for a Biden court nominee even in 2023, which means a couple things can happen. If in the midterm elections next year, Democrats maintain or increase the size of their majority, then Biden presumably could still move a Democratic Senate forward to confirm his nominee. But if Republicans were to retain control, there's now a possibility that at any point after January of 2023, Biden's nominee would not receive a hearing. As I said, that's led to a whole new level of concern on the left and a whole new round of pressure on Breyer to step aside while a Biden nominee could still replace him. Now, up until last week, it seemed like the more Breyer heard from the left, the more pressure he heard to step down, the less likely he seemed willing to. And you can understand that sentiment from Justice Breyer, whether you agree with it or not. He is in his 80s, but he is by all appearances in good health, physically and mentally. And being a Supreme Court justice is a pretty good job, I would imagine. And so it seems like the more pressure and the more calls that came from the left for Breyer to step down, the more Breyer dug in his heels. But then when Mitch McConnell began talking about this, I wonder if it might have had a different impact on Breyer. Because up until last week, it was Breyer's fellow Democrats. And yes, I know the justices are not partisan, but he was appointed by a Democratic president. So you get my point. But up until now, this is the type of thing that Breyer could dismiss as partisan harping that he didn't really have to pay attention to. But now McConnell's made it pretty clear that if Breyer were to step down for health or other reasons during the second 2 years of Biden's term, that Biden wouldn't be able to have a replacement confirmed. And it is worth wondering if, while the pressure from the left didn't have much impact on Breyer, if McConnell's statement from the right may have gotten Breyer thinking more seriously about this. So I'm going to ask a second question of you. First, I asked, of course, should Breyer retire? Now what I'm going to ask you, as you can see here, is I'm going to ask you to make a prediction. Do you think Breyer will retire before the midterm elections? Not whether you think it's a good idea or not, but whether, particularly given McConnell's recent statements, do you think that Breyer will change his mind? So we're going from your preference to your prediction. What do we have, Claire? Look at that. Very interesting. Wow. 80 to 20, our group wanted Breyer to step down before next November, but an absolutely dead even 50-50 split on whether you think it will happen. Very interesting. Let's talk, before we go on to our second topic though, let's talk a little bit more about the Supreme Court, because another interesting development on the current court is the seeming emergence of a three-justice center block made up of Chief Justice Roberts and of Justices Brett Kavanaugh and Amy Coney Barrett. There's in two very high-profile cases last week, one regarding the future of the Affordable Care Act, and the other addressing the question about whether the city of Philadelphia should continue to contract for foster care services with a religious organization that would not serve same-sex couples. And in both of those cases, Roberts opted to structure a narrower decision to keep Obamacare in place and to allow Philadelphia to continue its contract in order to achieve a majority, a unanimous majority, in fact, in the Philadelphia case, but rather than splitting the court over a more far-reaching decision. And in these cases, as well as others, the most conservative justices on the court, Samuel Alito, Clarence Thomas, and Neil Gorsuch, have argued very strongly that Roberts has marginalized them, and that by opting for a more restrained, a less aggressive decision, Roberts was able to fashion a greater majority for his preferences than Alito and Thomas and Gorsuch would have preferred. So while Roberts and Kavanaugh and Barrett obviously have still maintained their own conservative tendencies, these narrower decisions gave them an avenue to work with the three left-leaning judges to form a majority over conservative opposition. Now, make no mistake about it, Roberts and Kavanaugh and Barrett are very conservative, and the court is positioned well to the right of where it's been for several decades. But Roberts has always seen himself as a consensus builder, and he's always worked very hard to try to keep the court from being seen as a partisan instrument. And you may remember that in the original Obamacare decision, in which he sided with the then four Democratic nominated justices to maintain the Affordable Care Act. In on at least some cases, Roberts has found a way to attract support from two other conservative judges, Barrett and Kavanaugh, and create a center block to occupy the space in between the more ideological wings. So now this gets us back to a familiar question, one we visited in the past, about whether the court would benefit from some sort of restructuring. And you may remember that when Barrett was nominated, there was all sorts of talk among Democrats about whether the court should be expanded under a Democratic president. Now, calls for increasing the number of justices seem to have died down, as President Biden has indicated that that's not something he's all that excited about. And the possibility of imposing an age limit for justices looks equally improbable. But the other possibility that remains in discussion is the idea of an 18-year term limit, in which every 2 years, no matter what, a justice would step down and a president would nominate a new justice. So we would know in every presidential election that the man or woman who is elected president of the United States, in addition to their other responsibilities, would be responsible for nominating 2 Supreme Court justices over the course of their term, no matter what. And I imagine the candidates would campaign on this. In addition to pledges they made on taxes and immigration and climate change, they would talk, at least potentially, about who they would appoint to the Supreme Court, given the opportunity. And that's worth discussing further, I think, but unfortunately not today, because we have 2 other topics that we need to get to in the next 10, 15 minutes so that we can turn this into a conversation with all of you. So topic number 2, Iran has an election, sort of. Now, as most of you know, Iran held a presidential election last Friday. And in my opinion, Iran lost. Now, that's not a surprise. It was clear long before the votes were counted that the Iranian people were going to be the biggest losers in the election. We learned that earlier in the year when Iran's Guardian Council disqualified several prominent reform-minded candidates from the ballot. And what that did is it left a very hardline conservative candidate, Ibrahim Raisi, as the prohibitive favorite. And in fact, the Guardian Council removed hundreds of potential candidates from the ballot, including anyone who may have given Raisi a competitive race. And the campaign that ended up taking place was essentially a puppet show that allowed Iran's actual decision maker, the supreme leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, to install Raisi, who's his preferred candidate and his potential successor, into office. And the result will be an even more repressive regime with even less regard for the rights of its citizens and an even more antagonistic relationship with Israel and the rest. Now, a little bit of recent history here. For about 20 years now, a little bit more, Iranian presidential elections generally pit a more doctrinaire candidate, someone who's very close to the Ayatollahs, a very conservative, cleric-supported candidate, against an opponents with at least some instincts to relax societal constraints domestically and increase international domestic engagement for Iran. And in the elections where these choices were permitted, the reform candidates almost always won. Although we ought to note that Iranian-style reform is still much, much more restrictionist than how that term would be used in the West and even in other parts of the Middle East. But Khamenei's now in his 80s. And if he were to pass away, his death could create a vacuum that would allow an elected president to achieve a lot more power and a lot more influence than is currently the case. And Khamenei and his allies, his fellow clerics, didn't want to run the risk of giving that opportunity to a moderate president. So that's why they struck so many potential alternatives to Raisi from the ballot. And so any potential candidate who had ever talked about opening Iran either domestically or internationally was banned from the ballot. And that left only one relative centrist as a very weak opponent for the Ayatollah's preferred candidate. So the question now going forward is whether the installation of a more hardline government makes it more or less likely that negotiations over a nuclear agreement, over the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, will be completed. The Biden administration for months has been saying that they felt that if there was going to be a new nuclear agreement, it would have to be done before the June election, given the likelihood of Raisi's victory. But over the last few weeks, we've been hearing from the White House that actually the window for finishing a deal isn't until the beginning of August, until Raisi is actually sworn into office. So there's about 6 weeks left where at least potentially a new nuclear agreement could come together. Point worth noting is realistically a new Iranian president may not be all that relevant to the ultimate outcome of the negotiations. ultimately it's Khomeini and the other clerics that call the shots on these types of things, not the president. So a new August deadline might not make a lot of difference. But there's great symbolic value in this for Khomeini and the Ayatollahs, especially if he sees Rouhani as his potential successor should he, Khomeini, pass away. If an agreement were to be achieved between now and August between the United States and the other Western countries and Iran, the clerics could blame the moderates who are going out of office anyway. But then lifting of the Iranian sanctions, in addition to restricting the growth in their nuclear program, the lifted sanctions should help Iran's economy. And that's something that the new conservative leadership could take credit for. But either way, this is a decision that ultimately is going to be made by the Ayatollah, not by the president. So what does this mean for the US? Well, the ball is now clearly in Biden's court. Iran has actually tried to test him over the last few weeks, even while negotiations over a nuclear agreement in Vienna were progressing. Because even while they were negotiating on nuclear agreements, the Iranians also looked as though they were planning to deploy warships to cross the Atlantic for the first time with very advanced weaponry that they had sold to the Maduro regime in Venezuela. And the idea of Iran providing military weapons to Venezuela seemed like a way for Iran to determine how badly Biden wanted a nuclear agreement. And he wanted it so badly that he's willing to overlook such a provocative act in the US's own backyard in the Western Hemisphere. But ultimately, the Iranian military vessels ended up heading north instead of west. And it's presumed they're heading toward either Syria or Russia now, which suggests to me that the Biden administration has quietly told Iran that that type of move would not be tolerated, and that would, in fact, end the negotiations. So Biden's message to Iran continues to be that a new nuclear agreement is important, but not absolutely necessary. Now, Biden would clearly like a ban on non-nuclear weapons and a ban on Iran's support for terrorism as part of this new agreement. But Raisi's already said that that's absolutely off the table. So we'll wait for the next 6 weeks or so, and we'll see whether Biden is willing to walk away from a bad deal or if he thinks he can build support for something better. So let's see what our group thinks about all this, about the future in Iran, particularly the future of a potential nuclear agreement. And 3 options here for you. Do you think the US should re-enter a nuclear agreement with Iran? Option 1, yes, I do think we should re-enter a nuclear agreement, and we should return to the previous agreement. Option number 2, yes, we should sign an agreement, but it should include not just nuclear weapons, but non-nuclear weapons. And it should include a ban on Iran's terrorist activity in the region as well. Or third, no, I don't think the United States should enter a nuclear agreement with Iran. They clearly can't be trusted. So what did our group think about this, Claire? Very interesting. 61%, almost 2/3 of you, say that Biden should agree to a nuclear agreement, but only if expanded for non-nuclear weapons and terrorism. And since the newly elected Iranian president has said that's off the table, it looks like almost 2/3 of us are saying that perhaps an agreement isn't in order. 33% say we should go back to the previous agreement, just addressing nuclear weapons and not the ballistic missiles or the terrorism ban. And 7% say no agreement at all. So very interesting. And now with our last few minutes, let's go on to our third topic. And that's the possibility of a compromise on the ongoing debate over whether or not to remove the filibuster from Senate deliberations. Now, this is a topic that's been in the news quite a bit recently, given the very unlikely prospect of the Senate being able to pass voting rights legislation today. But along with the continued opposition from Republican senators for voting reform, Democratic voices calling for the elimination of the filibuster, not surprisingly, they're getting louder. Now, just this morning, Arizona Senator Kristen Sinema wrote an opinion piece in the Washington Post supporting the filibuster, indicating her opposition to getting rid of it. And so what we're seeing is it's not just her and Joe Manchin that want to keep the filibuster, but there's several other Democratic senators, moderate Democrats, who've expressed reservations to removing the filibuster, including Dianne Feinstein from California, who last week said that she wanted to maintain the filibuster. So it's not just two. There's a much bigger challenge ahead for Senate Democrats if they do want to eliminate the filibuster altogether. The op-ed is very interesting. I'd recommend it. Kirsten Sinema in the Washington Post today. She warns about what's come to be known as ricochet legislating. And ricochet legislating is the idea that while Democrats could use the lowering of the threshold from 60 votes to 51 votes to push through their agenda, that Republicans could just as easily undo it and pass their own agenda when they get the majority. So now, over the last couple of weeks, a compromise proposal has emerged, proposed by a very smart attorney and veteran of the Clinton administration, a man by the name of Ira Shapiro, who worked on Capitol Hill for many years. And what Shapiro suggests is that the filibuster be kept in place, but that the threshold be lowered not from 60 votes to 51, but rather from 60 votes to 55 votes. And so rather than the filibuster being stopped by an absolute majority, simply lowered a little bit further from 60 to 55. And there's historical precedent for this. But for more than 100 years, it took unanimous consent. It took every single senator to close debate and end a filibuster. Then in 1917, the Senate voted to institute a 2/3 threshold for ending debate. This took place after a group of 12 anti-war senators were able to kill a bill through filibustering that would have allowed President Wilson to arm merchant vessels in the face of German submarine attacks. So they said instead of an absolute unanimous majority for stopping debate, 2/3 would be good enough. Then in 1975, almost 60 years later, the threshold was lowered even further to 60 votes. And so Shapiro says, let's go one more step. We've gone from unanimous to 67 to 60. Let's go to 55. And maybe we can put together the votes to achieve that, preserving the original intent of the filibuster, but making it somewhat easier to overcome than seems to be the case in such highly polarized times. So what do you think of Ira Shapiro's proposal? Let's put it up. And actually, we'll give you a few options here. One, that the filibuster should be eliminated altogether. And if a majority of senators want something, they should get it. Second, the filibuster should remain in place. 60 votes, that's it's worked since 1975. Let's just keep it the way it is. Or third, the Shapiro option. I think the filibuster should be kept, but let's lower it from 60 to 55. And let's see what our group comes to, Claire, on this one. Wow, look at this. We're going to have to tell Ira how popular his proposal is with our group. 71%, more than 2/3, almost 3/4 of you like the idea of keeping the filibuster in place, but lowering the threshold. 20% say let's get rid of it altogether, and 10% say let's keep it as it is. But an overwhelming majority for simply lowering that threshold. Very interesting. One other change, just before we wrap up, that often gets overlooked in the filibuster discussion, in addition to lowering of the threshold, as I just talked about it, is another change that was made. It was back in 1970, when the Senate introduced what was called a 2-track filibuster. Now, prior to 1970, as you may remember from watching Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, a filibuster would stop the Senate from moving on to any other legislative activity. So if you were filibustering, the Senate couldn't do anything. What the 2-track filibuster does is it allows the majority leader, with either unanimous consent or with the agreement of the minority leader, to have more than one main motion pending on the floor as unfinished business. So Senator Smith or Senator Jones or Senator Gonzalez might be filibustering the voting rights bill, but the Senate can still act on immigration legislation. And of course, that's made it much, much easier to filibuster because it hasn't stopped all Senate activity. It's just stopped activity on the objectionable bill. Now, if there's a sliver of good news, It looks like bipartisan talks are still progressing on infrastructure legislation. And there also seems to be the possibility, at least, for compromise on police reform and immigration policy. So we'll keep track of those bills going forward. But right now, at least, a full repeal of the filibuster seems unlikely. Let's see if a compromise on this front is achievable too. So with that, we're right at 11:30. Let's get to my favorite part of the program, where not only Jessica joins us, but where all of you, or many of you, get to weigh in. So Jessica, how are you?
I'm doing well. How are you doing, Dan?
Good. Thanks for coming on. How are we doing for questions today?
We're doing great. Before we launch into the Q&A session, I just want to thank our viewers for your continued support. As you know, we depend on your donations to cover our expenses so that we can continue to bring you these important discussions. So if you're able to make a donation, please go to our website, lawacth.org, and click on the donate button, and we will greatly appreciate your support. So thank you so much. Commercials over, and here's our first question. Why is it that the media, when opining on the outcome of a Supreme Court decision, seems to come to an immediate conclusion on how the liberals will find, and yet has difficulty in determining the probable finding on the conservative side? Why is it that the findings on the conservative side are often mixed, but not so on the liberal side?
Well, I guess there's a couple answers to that question. That's a really good question. So first of all, this phenomena is a relatively recent one. For those of you whose memory on these things goes back into the 20th century, you'll remember that there are any number of justices nominated by Democrats, people like former Justice White, for example, who would vote on conservative on some issues, with the conservatives on some issues. And there were justices nominated by Republican justices. David Souter comes to mind, for example, who would frequently vote with the quote unquote liberal justices. So the hardening of the ideological lines on the court is a relatively recent phenomena. And I don't know that that the media is any better or worse at guessing one side's motives or the others. I would put this more in John Roberts' lap. Like I said, Roberts decided when he became Chief Justice, it appears, that he did not want his court to be seen as an automatic partisan weapon. And he's made some efforts. Reasonable people can disagree on whether he's made sufficient efforts or not, to try to keep the court above the partisan fray when that's been possible. And it appears like on some issues, at least, he's found probably not consistent, but at least occasional allies in Barrett and Kavanaugh. And ultimately the fact that a more narrow decision does allow for some more flexibility sometimes does mean less predictability. The second point I'd make on this before we go on is I might suggest that the circumstances under which Kavanaugh and Barrett both came to the court were so highly charged and so partisan. I think it may have led a lot of people to determine that Kavanaugh and Barrett themselves were not just conservative, but were very doctrinaire. The bitterness of the fight regarding Kavanaugh's personal history, the bitterness of the debate over the circumstances surrounding Barrett's nomination really drew incredibly hard partisan and polarized battle lines. And I'm not suggesting for a moment that Barrett and Kavanaugh are not conservatives, because of course they are. But I wonder if the circumstances under which their nominations took place may have caused some people to assume that they were more inflexible than at least sometimes appears to be the case.
Isn't McConnell's position anathema to Senate tradition as defined and written by the late Senator Robert Byrd, described as the conscience of the Senate?
Well, McConnell's argument on this, and I'm not taking sides, but just providing the other, is McConnell argues that in fact, long before Robert Byrd, the Senate generally did not confirm justices when the Senate was held in the last year of a president's term, when the Senate was held by a different party than the president. And he points all the way back to 1880 as the last time an opposition led Senate confirmed a president's justice in the final year of their term. My own feeling on this, without taking sides in the debate, is both sides, both Biden and McConnell, can cite ample historical precedent, because as we've seen in the past, when it suits their purposes, both Republicans and Democrats are also willing to ignore historical precedent if it serves their immediate purposes. And so while I find the historical argument to be an interesting and sometimes instructive one, ultimately the question is not what happened 10 or 20 or 50 or 100 years ago, but who has the votes today? And in 2016, Mitch McConnell had the votes. Today, he doesn't. And in 2023, whether he does or not will determine whether Biden, if given the opportunity, will be able to have a nominee confirmed.
Is muted. Considering Patrick Leahy and Bernie Sanders are older and have had serious health issues and are from states with Republican governors, shouldn't Breyer step down yesterday rather than wait until next year?
Well, that's the other argument that Breyer should step down now, is that in a 50-50 Senate, all it takes is one senator to switch sides, as Vermont Senator Jim Jeffords did in 2001, depriving Republicans of a majority in a 50-50 Senate, or as the questioner suggested, an elderly senator either passing away or stepping down because of health reasons. Sanders and Leahy, who are both among the oldest senators, are probably not the best examples, if only because the Republican governor of Vermont has pledged that if either steps down, he, the governor, would replace them with a senator from their own party. But the average age of the Senate is at an all-time high, and there are several older Democratic senators representing states with Republican governors. So for those who are as concerned about McConnell's preferences on this as the questioner is, 2023 for Breyer's resignation might not be soon enough. The question is whether Breyer himself decides that's the best decision for him. I'm always a little bit nervous, partisan politics aside, on the left or the right, of shoving someone out of a job before they're ready to go. As I get older, I get increasingly nervous about that myself. So I'm always hesitant to say that a person of an advanced age who clearly still has their faculties should step aside. But the political consequences, as the questioner suggests, are tremendous. And so based less on the criticism and pressure from the left, but more on the interview that McConnell did last week from the right, my guess is that Breyer is thinking about this a lot more seriously now than he was before McConnell started talking.
The Presidential Commission on the Supreme Court of the United States' purpose is to provide an analysis of the principal arguments in the contemporary public debate for and against Supreme Court reform, including an appraisal of the merits and legality of particular reform proposals. Sorry, I can't talk. It has 6 months to report back to Biden. What are the chances for any reform to take place?
Well, Biden himself has made it clear that he's not all that wild about expanding the size of the court. So I think that one's pretty unlikely. But I do think the possibility of term limits, particularly if imposed on the type of rotation, the time of cycle that I was talking about earlier, I think the possibility there is relevant. It's not a huge possibility, but I think it's a reasonable possibility. And if we do end up in another Supreme Court fight over the next couple of years, as we've been talking about, I think that if the commission does recommend an 18-year term limit, as we've discussed, I think the interest in that may grow.
Thank you. Going back to your suggestion of an 18-year term limit, if it is an 18-year limit, how do you account for vacancies that occur during a term?
Well, there's several different proposals made on this. One is simply that the seat would be vacant until that next regularly scheduled appointment time came up. The more plausible alternative, it seems to me, is the next appointment would simply be accelerated. And I think what you'd probably end up doing is splitting it in half. In other words, if the nominee passed away before a president made his or her second nomination in the third year of their term, then you just simply move it up. But if the president had already made two nominations and had two justices confirmed, I think it would become tricky to give that person a third, giving a justice's incapacitation. At that point, you either, as I said a moment ago, the seat either would remain vacant for a relatively extended period of time, perhaps for as much as 2 years, or the other potential option is I've heard many supporters of the 18-year term limit suggest that the justices after their 18 years would not simply retire, be put out to pasture, but that they would work as federal judges in some capacity. And it's entirely possible that a system could be arranged that temporary replacements could sit in for the vacancy. But it's a great question, and that's exactly the type of question that the commission is going to be considering before they make their recommendations in the near future.
Why do you think Mitch McConnell made the statements he did about a potential Supreme Court appointment when there isn't one pending?
Well, first of all, he was asked. Second of all, McConnell never misses an opportunity to remind his party's base of the importance of judicial nominations and the role that McConnell has played in those nomination fights in the past. That's always his some politicians will use issues like immigration or climate change or taxes to remind their base, why they're on one side or the other. For McConnell, it's judicial nominations and confirmations, and whenever that opportunity comes up, he grabs it. I'm less certain as to why he entertained the possibility of extending his decision from 2024 to 2023. It does seem to me, as I said earlier, that might increase the likelihood of Breyer stepping down before next November. And I don't know why that works for McConnell's benefit. So on one hand, yeah, he's stoking the base. On the other hand, he may have caused himself a complication, an unneeded complication. That said, Jessica, and if you and I had been having this conversation in the spring of 2016 when you refused to hold hearings for Garland, I probably would have said the same thing then. And it turned out that McConnell was right and I would have been wrong. So that's my opinion, but McConnell is obviously thinking about this in a much different context than I am, which is probably often.
Iran's recent elections produced a new president. However, there are no real winners. Engineered is an actual term in usage in Iran to pave the way for an Ayatollah-approved leadership succession. Will there be any difference with Iran's approach to the US?
I don't think so. If anything, it's entirely possible that the approach may get harsher, get more harsh, more harsh. Help me out, Jessica.
2 syllables, so harsher.
Okay, great, thank you. In either case, as we talked about earlier in the program, ultimately it's the Ayatollah making these decisions. So it's not clear whether Khomeini, has decided that a more aggressive approach is necessary. I think, going back to something we talked about earlier, I think the Iranian leadership was testing Biden over the last few weeks when they began to send their military vessels, at least theoretically, across the Atlantic toward Venezuela. That would have been an unprecedented, aggressive, and provocative step. And I think they wanted to see how Biden would respond and if he'd continue the negotiations. And Biden did not make a declarative statement publicly about this, but those Iranian military vessels did very abruptly cut off their westward route and instead head north. I don't think that Iran would have done that without at least some private messaging from Biden or the Biden administration. I don't think anything is going to change in the long run. My guess is that the reason that Khomeini limited the ballot options this year is not because he wanted to change direction now, but he wanted to increase the likelihood of an equally hardline successor should he pass away. So I think the test for Biden, as I said earlier, over the next 6 weeks is, do you take a deal, either a bad deal or less than ideal deal, depending on how you, as an individual, each of you think about it. But do you take a deal that you're not all that excited about if you're Biden in order to have one? Or are you willing to walk away from the negotiating table? And I don't think that changes regardless of who the president is.
The Trump administration put sanctions on Raisi in 2019. Do you agree that the Biden administration should remove sanctions on the newly elected Iranian president?
It's a great question. I don't. I don't think those sanctions should be removed. There are several different levels of economic sanctions that the US has put on Iran over the years. Some of them, not all of them, would be removed as part of a new nuclear agreement. It's one of the reasons that Biden's advisors say that they believe that Iran will be willing to stay at the negotiating table, even if there's a nuclear-only agreement renegotiated. And they said they're not going to take off those other sanctions just because there's a nuclear agreement, but there's other, less forgivable behaviors. They're going to require further discussions. Given what Raisi did or is alleged to have done, I don't think lifting his sanctions would be a part of a nuclear agreement if he were not president. So I don't think they should be part of a nuclear agreement because he is. I don't know actually how hard the Iranians are pushing to have his sanctions removed. They might be pushing, but I would bet probably not all that hard. I'd be surprised but not astounded if the Biden administration were to lift them, because given what Raisi has done in the past, taking those sanctions off would be a pretty big step, and I think would require a much bigger counteraction on Iran's part than a nuclear agreement.
Since the US walked away from the JCPOA, how do Americans think the US has credibility to pursue an expanded agreement? Further, has anyone considered the views of other signatories to the JCPOA?
So to the first part of the question, the Iranians do not trust, or state that they do not trust, the United States, to the point where these negotiations in Vienna that have been going on for months do not include US and Iranian negotiators sitting face to face. The Iranians refuse to meet with the US representatives. And so, in fact, the other parties to the original agreement end up doing a variation of shuttle diplomacy in which they go back and forth between the Iranian and the US delegations. So there's not a lot of trust there. That said, regardless of what you thought of the original agreement, or regardless of what you thought about the decision of Trump to walk away from it, there's no question that Trump's decision has had a devastating effect on Iran's economy. And I think not just Iran's elected leaders, but even its clerics and ayatollahs know that at a certain point, they need to be able to provide some type of economic relief and economic sustenance for their citizens. And the best way to achieve that is with some level of sanctions relief. So in other words, they might not trust the US that far, but they're willing, at least theoretically, to come to an agreement to have the sanctions listed, not because they've come to trust the United States, but because of how desperately they need an economic recovery in that country. And what that means to the second part of the question is the other parties to the original deal are critically necessary, not only as intermediaries between the US and Iran, but in order to encourage conversations forward on non-nuclear arms, on ballistic missiles, on terrorist activity, and other issues that certainly will not be part of this original agreement.
Will Israeli objection to a new agreement influence Biden?
I don't know. It's instructive that one of Naftali Bennett's first public statements was to denounce the prospect of a nuclear agreement. And it's equally noteworthy that upon Raisi's election last Friday, how quickly Bennett used the election of someone with Raisi's history as additional rationale for not coming to an agreement with Iran. I don't think that Biden would turn down the deal just because Israel didn't like it. Otherwise, there wouldn't be any negotiations going on at all. But I think it's an influencing factor. And if Biden believes that the Iranians will continue with another round of negotiations after a new nuclear agreement for ballistic missiles and terrorism activity, then my guess is he comes to that agreement regardless of what Israel says. So it's and if he believes that Iran is just giving lip service to further agreements on non-nuclear and terrorist-related issues, then Biden probably does not sign. I think it's an open question, and we should probably set aside another topic for this, Jessica, in the not too distant future, is to whether Biden actually wants a nuclear agreement or not, or whether he's simply going through these efforts in order to strengthen his relationship with European allies. Because as we've talked about in many, many previous programs, Biden, needs Europe on his side for dealing with Russia and China. So negotiating with Iran, whether you actually come to an agreement or not, might be a savvy way for Biden to improve those relationships. But I don't see Israel's feelings in it, for better or worse, being a determinative factor in where Biden ultimately comes down.
Thank you. You mentioned China. So this questioner said, how does China, who has taken a strong lead in the Iranian economy, play in talks with USA on no nukes?
Well, this is a fascinating question, because not only does China, and for that matter, Russia, have very strong and strength and growing relationships with Iran, but China has an excellent relationship with Israel also. And Israeli leaders for the last couple of years have let it be known to the United States that they think the US is being unnecessarily belligerent when it comes to China, and that Israel, like many of the Western democracies, will just as soon not be forced to take sides in disagreements between the US and China. So the lack of a nuclear agreement between the US and Iran does provide additional opportunities for China, but it's not quite that simple, because China's role in Israel complicates the matter even further. Either way, China has established itself as a major player throughout the Middle East, and that's not going to end anytime soon, regardless of whether there's a nuclear agreement or not.
Thank you. Barack Obama called the filibuster a Jim Crow relic, arguing that the procedure should be eliminated if it is to block voting reforms. The For the People Act, a comprehensive democracy reform bill, was passed by the House of Representatives and introduced in the Senate, where the filibuster may determine its fate. What are its chances?
Its chances aren't very good. We know not only that Manchin and Sinema are against eliminating the filibuster, but we also know that those two senators are providing cover for several other Democratic senators who don't like the idea of getting rid of it either. Dianne Feinstein stated last week that she was opposed to the elimination of the filibuster, which surprised a lot of people. But there's a large number of other senators, Sinema's fellow Arizona, Senator Kelly, Senator Tester from Montana, Senator Warner from Virginia, Senators Hassan and Shaheen from New Hampshire, Senator King from Maine. There's a lot of Democratic senators who've expressed reservations about getting rid of the filibuster, and they're not all that unhappy to have Manchin and Sinema taking all the heat for them. So getting 50 votes plus Kamala Harris is going to be a lot. I would encourage you to read Senator Sinema's opinion piece in the Washington Post this morning, because she very carefully and very gently calls out several of her fellow Democratic senators by noting that when the Democrats held a majority in the Senate, large numbers of her fellow senators who now oppose the filibuster supported it then. And she notes that Vice President Biden was a supporter of the filibuster back in the Barack Obama's administration too. She didn't mention Obama in the piece, but she certainly could have. So I think this 55-seat compromise that Mr. Shapiro has suggested is probably the best bet for progress. Absolutely eliminating it or getting down to a 50-vote margin, I just simply don't see that happening, no matter how angry moderate Democrats get at the way Republicans conduct themselves on voting rights or immigration or any other issue.
Is there anything you read in Sinema's statements about the filibuster that make you think she might be open to some change, at least on voting rights, if the Senate won't even vote to debate? H.R. 1, after all, she's a sponsor of that bill.
Well, Sinema is a sponsor of the bill. In fact, every Democratic senator is a co-sponsor of the voting legislation. But Sinema is among several Democratic senators, once again, who, even though they're co-sponsors of the legislation, have publicly mentioned concerns they have about it or changes they'd like to see made in it going forward. I don't think that the outcome of the Voting Rights Act, and I disagree with Senator Schumer and I disagree with the White House on this one, so I very much could be wrong. But there seems to be an assumption among some in the White House, and there seems to be an assumption with Senator Schumer and other Democratic Senate leadership, that if the Republicans continue to be so confrontational and so unwilling to negotiate on the Voting Rights Act, that will drive these reluctant Democratic senators to support the elimination of the filibuster. I'm not saying it can't happen, but I'm saying I'd be pretty surprised if it did.
What do you think of the proposal that the opposition must have 41 senators present at all times and that the floor must be held by speakers?
I like that because actually having the 41 objecting senators physically present puts a much greater burden on them than the way the system is currently set up. And if a filibuster is more difficult to achieve, then maybe it happens less frequently. This goes back to the point that I was making just before we opened to all of your questions in our group discussion, the often overlooked change that was made in 1970 when the Senate went to a two-track filibuster. The reason the filibuster is used so much more now is because business can continue on every other issue. If a filibuster were to stop action on any Senate issue, I think it would be used a lot less frequently. And I think the questioner's point about a 41 physical presence requirement would do largely the same thing.
Could adjusting the filibuster number be adjusted down to 55, but only for a set number of years? Then it would return to 60 in a less partisan environment.
I don't know that you could put a time limit in. I mean, I guess technically the Senate could pass anything they wanted to, and then we'd see if it held up in court. I think putting a time limit on it is less likely than having the 55 vote threshold for certain types of issues, not for every vote. So for example, maybe voting reform could qualify for this lowered threshold filibuster, but other types of legislation might not. I think you'd be less I think you'd have a much more difficult time getting those senators who are reluctant to change the filibuster to agree to a 55 vote compromise if they felt that there was a rubber band effect that was going to turn it back in a certain number of years. But I think the way to further this compromise is less chronologically and more on the matter of the substance of the bills under consideration.
You mentioned Israel and China enjoy an excellent relationship. Were you only referring to China's desire for Israeli tech exports, including dual use, or is there their relationship deeper than that?
It appears to me, and this is something I'm not a topic on which I'm not an expert, is that while the potential for technology sharing is considerable and is probably represents the greatest portion of China's interest, I don't believe that discussions between China and Israel are limited to simply to Israel's technology, whether dual use or otherwise. But I'll admit I don't know that for certain. That's an educated guess on my part, but just a guess.
Awesome. Well, that kind of wraps up our hour. So if you are a member and you're interested in joining Dan's after the webinar sessions, please email our membership director. She is at kshabanava@lawalk.org. You can see if she still has capacity. It is a limited space, so we try to keep it small, and there tends to be a wait list, but we'd love to have you join us. And Dan, I'll see you over there in a couple of minutes.
Just a quick thank you, Dan. Excellent as always. We learned so much, and it helps us navigate all these complex issues. So thank you so much, and we all look forward to your after program just in a few minutes. For those of you who are our viewers are interested in our upcoming programs, of course, Politics in the Time of Coronavirus every Tuesday at 11 a.m. This Thursday, the Honorable Gray Davis, our former 37th Governor of California, will be speaking on crisis leadership, meeting the populist challenge. And on July 8th, Preserving Los Angeles, how historic places can transform America's cities. So please go to our website, register today, make a donation, become a member, stay safe, stay informed, and we hope to see you Thursday.